Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sportlight podcast. On this week's Sportlight podcast, we're going to sit down with Dr. Sheldon Martin, and we are going to talk about a new resource, the 988 phone number, and how it can be used to help those who are dealing with suicidal ideation themselves, or if they have a family member, a friend, a teammate who is struggling with those things. This gives a tool to allow them to help. And then we're also just going to talk about the topic of suicide in general and how families and organizations might be able to help in the most beneficial ways.
Welcome to the Sportlight podcast for parents, coaches, and athletes. The Sportlight refers to the time in an athlete's life when they have increased ability to affect the culture around them and the increased opportunity to learn life's lessons through sports. This podcast aims to help parents and coaches capitalize on their athletes' precious time in the Sportlight. The Sportlight podcast is brought to you by Especially for Athletes program.
Well, hello, everyone. We're here with Dr. Sheldon Martin. He's been kind enough to join us again and to talk about a really important subject that we like to bring up frequently on our podcast and do about a yearly podcast on this subject, and that is the subject of suicide and suicidal ideation. And as many of you know who listen to this podcast, we encourage our athletes to keep their eyes up, looking for those who are in need, and then do the work to help them when they see they're struggling in any way. And there's a new tool that Dr. Martin introduced us to and told us about. I've seen some commercials about it, and that is the new 988 phone number. And so, Sheldon, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today and for joining us and lending your expertise here. And so thank you, first of all, for being here.
You're welcome. No problem. Thank you for the invitation.
So the first question is, what is this new 988 phone number and why should people be aware of it?
Great question. So the number and the service has actually existed for some time, but it was a 10-digit phone number. It was a national crisis hotline number. And a 10-digit number is very difficult to memorize or to remember. And so through legislation and a lot of great effort, anytime an individual is or family member has questions regarding suicide, mental health, or substance abuse because of their interrelation, they can dial 988, and much like a 911 number, 988 will direct you to the operators on the other line to help with that specific situation. And so it was taking a 10-digit number, making it 988 so that everyone could remember it easily. And now we have this amazing resource that if we put some energy behind and awareness to, individuals all across the country have it literally at the disposal of their phone. Just three numbers: 988 for suicidal ideation, mental health concerns, and substance abuse concerns.
And that number connects them to who?
Well, there's professionals on the other end. Everyone is trained, and they have a little bit of a different structure that I am not 100% familiar with. If it's a psychologist on the other end, or if it's someone who holds a certification and a license. But what the good news is that person's job on the other end is a operator of this line. Much like 911, the person you get on the other end, they are trained to help, and they're trained to direct and to get you the resources that you need and to get you them quickly.
Awesome. And in your initial answer, I think you addressed this a little bit, but who is this number for? Who can call 988?
So especially individuals, anyone that is experiencing suicidal ideation or some real mental health challenges, and like I said, substance abuse, right? If someone knows that they have a real challenge with drugs, with alcohol, illegal drugs, call, and these individuals can help point you in the right direction for those resources. You can also call on behalf of someone else. It is important. Remember, it's a crisis line. And so you'd never want to minimize, right? Just like with 911, we never want to tell someone don't call. The message is always, call. But sometimes we know that you may call and it's not the right place. You don't need 911, right? We've had those funny YouTube videos and that of the young man that calls and tries to get help with his homework. So those stories are probably going to happen, but we don't want the message to be try to be the filter yourself. Just call if you have any question, but it is designed for crisis situations.
Well, and this reminds me of one of the last times you were on our podcast and you taught us that really helpful acronym ACT, that when someone's going through difficulty and you're worried that maybe they are considering taking their own life, that you ask them, are you planning on hurting yourself? And you've said in the past that typically statistics will show that if they are really considering hurting themselves, then they will tell you that is the case. And then and then you said to care, to show that compassion and care for them, and then tell. So sit with them in their pain, care, ask them questions, be with them, but then tell somebody. And it sounds to me like this is another option. Sometimes some kids are hesitant to go to a school counselor, to go to a coach, to go to a parent, to go to the person's parent. But it seems to me that this would be one of those places where if a friend has said, yes, I'm planning on hurting myself, that calling 988 would be an option there to tell in that acronym.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've tried to use 911 and 988 have different purposes, but the analogy goes across the board pretty well. If I look out my window and I see that there is an individual who there's something happening to my neighbor's home, it's on fire, I call 911 and say, hey, my neighbor's house is on fire. Can you please send the fire department? Well, that analogy works pretty well with 988, right? I have a friend that I'm worried about them. They need help. Those same types of follow-up questions may be answered, right? Who is your friend? Where are they? Okay, how can we intervene? How can we help? And so I think it's a pretty good analogy with 988 when you're the person who's trying to help someone else as well.
Great. And then here's a question. You've mentioned it already, but when should you call 988? I know this is redundant, Sheldon, here, but give me a scenario where you would call and a scenario when you wouldn't call.
Well, a scenario where I would call is if I were an individual and I have had thoughts that I was going to harm myself and I didn't know where to turn. In that case, I could call 988 or 911 and it would work out. Either one, but call 988 would be just fine. Or my friend, I talked to him after practice, and I tried calling and texting, they're not responding. I don't know what to do. That would be a time to call 988. Right? When I wouldn't call, when I would call 911, is when you want a paramedic to show up. So I know that sounds trying to separate them a little bit. Both situations are a crisis, but just think of it this way: do I want a therapist on the other end, or do I need a paramedic to show up? That's kind of a little bit of a difference with 988 and 911. And another time to call 988, probably the best use case would be, I know I need to get some help. I don't know where to go.
Awesome.
Right? That would be a great use case to call 988 and employees who are trained in getting the right crisis services with where you live.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. So,
Yeah.
Do you think we can move on to another topic that we've discussed a little bit, and I would love to get your thoughts on? Obviously, when there's a suicide at a school or in a community or in a family, I mean, it is one of the most crushing experiences that people have. And I remember something that you had said to me a couple of years ago when a popular TV Netflix show came out, 13 Reasons Why, where a bunch of kids were watching it. It was like the most popular Netflix series for a little while. And the premise behind this show is that this young lady who ended up taking her own life, she had made these cassette tapes and would deliver them to people. And those people were listening to these cassette tapes, and it was helping them understand, if I understand it correctly, kind of the role that they played in her committing suicide, this young lady committing suicide. And it would flash back as they started listening to the tapes, and then they would kind of be in the experience that led to her having the difficulties that she had, that led to her taking her own life. And I remember during that time that you saying that you're sure that the producers of that, well, maybe you weren't sure, I don't know, but were well-meaning and trying to bring this message that the way we treat people is really important and we need to be careful about the way we treat people. But there was some things about that show that made you a little bit uncomfortable, that you thought might do more harm than good. Would you mind sharing just some of those thoughts on that? And then I would love to talk about how we can, in healthy ways, respond to these situations in our communities and schools and even families. And so what concerned you about that show, I guess, is the first question.
Well, what concerned me, especially when we talk about young people, but this applies to everyone. The brain doesn't fully develop till 25, and with that comes it's almost impossible to fully comprehend the finality of some decisions, and so because we know that young people already are going to have a difficulty in processing the finality of a decision, I worried that as we looked at a story regarding death by suicide, that it romanticized it a little bit, like, oh, this is what would happen, and this is how it would play out. And my fear was that those who were already in a vulnerable spot, that they would be more vulnerable. I would never give advice on how someone is supposed to react after a death by suicide. I don't think that would be mine to direct or control. But I would say the following: when someone does die by suicide, in a good way, there's an outpouring of love. There's an outpouring of openness, which I think is good, and I hope that remains. I think that school officials and parents and families need to know that those young people who are already in a vulnerable spot may be in a even increased moment of vulnerability. Because if we don't understand the finality of a decision, and we see the outpouring of love for someone else, it may put someone in a situation where they make a decision where otherwise they may not, if those two factors were not so intense in that moment. So when you say, what can we do? Well, I would in this moment, I mean, before it happens, before something happens, but especially immediately following, that we should get real serious about prevention and intervention. I think it would be wise, it would be healthy for a coaching staff, let's say, of all the meetings you have preseason, right? Of all the plays and what are the schemes and who's going to play what, and do we, who's on JV, who's on varsity. I mean, there's so many conversations. I really think it would be worth it to take 20 minutes and what an example if a head coach said, hey, different conversation. What are we all going to do to help prevent suicide as a team? With our players, with our coaches first, with our players, what are we going to do? We want to talk suicide prevention. We want to talk intervention. What happens if someone texts a teammate and a teammate texts us? Do we know what to do? And you really do think about that 20-minute conversation could be so impactful and so influential, and could really outline what we can do to get serious about prevention now, right? And that way, when there are situations where someone may be in an increased spot of vulnerability, we're working a plan that we already have in place, and we're trying to respond in a way that is very conscientious and proactive with those that we may be concerned about. Does that help?
It does, yes. If I hear you correctly, it's every now and then we kind of put a bunch of energy toward honoring those who have taken their own life. And of course, gosh, man, I understand in this podcast right now, we're walking a little bit on eggshells, Sheldon, because
we do not have to have a decrease in outpouring of love in any way.
Yeah. But what I hear you saying is, okay, so let's say there's a kid who's left out, a kid who feels down or perceives that no one values them, and they're considering taking their own life. And then a kid does take their own life. And then they come to school the next day and they see the whole school dressed up, and the whole school is rightfully so just so concerned about the family of the person who's taken their own life. They just want to, it's almost like young people sometimes don't know what to do. And so they're just, okay, we're going to all dress up and we're going to show that we love, that we care, that we worry about this family. And it's an outward expression of an inward feeling that they have of just despair for this family. But what you're saying is to recognize that the kid who's lonely, who perceives that no one values them, is coming to school and they see the whole school dressed up. They see some kids in tears. They see people reacting. That may put them in an increased vulnerable position, because all of a sudden they're seeing someone receiving everything that they feel that they're longing for and lacking, and that their brains aren't developed enough to understand the finality that, yes, this will happen for a day, for a week. People will be thinking about that person, and the whole school will be rocked by that for a day. But then, life goes on, and lunches happen, Friday nights happen, football games happen, and life marches on. But the finality of that decision is still there, and there's still a family and loved ones that are just, in horrible pain that will last forever because of that. And so you see that I'm walking eggshells here, because I never want to act like, oh, these nice things that we're doing. So you're saying, okay, we aren't saying don't do the nice things, but we probably should consider the fact that sometimes those gestures that occur around an event like this, they increase the vulnerability of those who were already vulnerable. Did I hear that part correct?
Yeah, I think that summarizing statement at the end is well said, that those in a vulnerable spot after certain events, including death by suicide of another, they can be in an increased vulnerable spot.
Okay.
Right? And we should be very aware of that. So let's say that we do have someone close to us that we have been talking to, and then they're in a good spot. Well, that would be a great thing, though, if it was a common person that we knew that had died by suicide, that we reach out, hey, how are you? How you doing? Like, let's talk, right? Recognizing that they may be in an increased vulnerable spot.
Yeah. And then that's one way you said, instead of focusing all of our intention on honoring a person's life or mourning with a family who's experienced this, to take some of those feelings that are welled up in us and move them more toward intervention. And you talked about the coach example, taking aside their team and saying, hey, let's talk about this. You talked about, if you know someone who is dealing with suicidal thoughts, that you might contact them. If there's someone who's contacted you, talked to you, trusted you in the past, that when one of these events happen, it might be a good time to reach out to them and say, hey, how are you doing? And make sure that they aren't being impacted in a negative way by this event, to the point that they're now considering doing the same thing themselves. And so any other interventions that the coaches talking, those individuals in our life and family members, any other healthy interventions you could think of for a school or organization when they experience something like this?
Yeah. Even those who may not be in a vulnerable spot previous may be drawn into a very vulnerable spot right after. And so it is worth every effort to supply grief counselors, to put every resource we can possible toward buoying up the school, the team, those around them, if this occurs, because we all know how this works. There can be a life event that dramatically alters how we view things very quickly. Yeah. And so it would be very important to bring support to the school, even for those that you would assume, oh, they're they have expressed a vulnerability or they're doing great. Just don't make that assumption. Just offer that support for anyone and be very proactive about it, because it impacts people in different ways.
So, Sheldon, most of the people who listen to our podcast are players on teams, coaches, parents who, and you and I both have children who play sports, and you know that oftentimes those children, your children's teammates are in your house a lot, right? Yeah. So can you kind of put yourself in a coach's position? And I know you've already kind of taken us to this, but I think it's healthy to kind of think through this with you're a coach at a school and someone has just taken their life and it's the next day and you're standing in front of your team. What would you say that would be an intervention and helpful in that situation if you were a coach?
It's great, Shad. I'm glad the way that you asked that, because it connects us to our first topic. What I might do as a coach is I'd call the school and I would call the counseling office and say, I'd like someone from your office to come and talk with the team. I want not only to make support optional. I would love to just take some practice time or time together today. Can you do that? Oh, coach, what time would that be? We're spread pretty thin. Of course we're in these 3 different locations. Okay, let me do this. I'm going to call 988 and I'm going to explain to them what happened. I'm going to ask them if they can point me in the direction of finding someone that can come and speak to the team right away. Right? That type of an approach could be, the coach knows what to do and they do not have to feel the pressure of being a mental health professional, especially because, I don't ever want to minimize this, the coach may be the one who is struggling most, depending on the situation.
Yeah, if it's someone on their team, for example, you're speaking as though this is someone on their team, kind of a thing. That could be very, boy, that would
or as
be
a teacher
difficult.
at the school and they teach them in a class, and right. But I think saying also, Shad, that what's helpful, saying this is our plan. If this happens, this is what we're going to do as a team. Well, then you just kind of enact the plan. Because if you're kind of hurting too, it's that moment, just be like, well, here's what we said to do outside of the moment. Let's call the counseling office. Let's have someone come and give us advice and talk to us. Let us process. If they're just overworked because of the situation at the school right now, let's call 988 and see if there's someone else that could come and help.
That's awesome.
That would be a fantastic plan.
That's great. And for a school administration, which we speak to a lot of school administrations as well. And of course, they receive training from many, many places in our wonderful education system. And so, but that having a plan of action, when this occurs, this is what we will do. That seems to be very, very helpful and helps us be intentional and in our intervention to think through it before we're in that moment. And so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Sheldon, thank you. We know we have you come on and talk about these heavy topics with us, and you're a former athlete as well. I'm sure you have a lot of other things to say and to add to the other things that we talk about, but we sure do appreciate you taking the opportunity to help us look at these situations through the lens of coaching and having kids that play sports and having teammates, and to be able to have someone of your knowledge and ability to be able to say, okay, now take us to the demographic we're talking to and help us with that. And you do such a great job of that. So just wanted to express appreciation for you and thank you for taking the time today to do that. Do you have any final thoughts on this subject at all?
No, but we've through the great podcast you guys are doing, I think there's a couple of key takeaways, right? Ask, care, tell. Ask directly, care what they say, tell someone who could do something about it, right? Well, who do I tell? Well, 988 is a great option. There's crisis services there. It's a great way to a great number to memorize so we can use it in a crisis. And then third, let's make sure that leading up to and following any tragic event that we are serious about prevention and intervention. And I think that would be my summary message.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for being with us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining the Sportlight podcast today. We hope that you'll spread this message, share this. If you ever have a school or a team that's experiencing these difficult moments, this might be a good one to review and to think about. We hope that we can help and save lives. And as our athletes keep their eyes up and look for people who might need them and do the work, especially in these most vulnerable of situations, we hope to arm them with these tools like 988 and how to intervene and things like that. Because if all of this effort saved one family from going through what a family goes through when someone takes their life, it would be so well worth it. So Dr. Martin, thank you. And everyone else, keep your eyes up and do the work.
This has been the Sportlight podcast from Especially for Athletes, sponsored by Coca-Cola. You can learn more about Especially for Athletes by visiting the website at especiallyforathletes.org. You can also learn more about the book, The Sportlight, by Shad Martin and Dustin Smith at especiallyforathletes.org/book.